Hello, this is Dr. Todd Daniel, Director of the RSTATS Institute at Missouri State University. Today, I'm going to be sharing with you some ideas about research related to a project that I did for my dissertation and that I'm now continuing with Children's Division for the Missouri Department of Mental Health. The title of the project was Compassion Fatigue and Job Satisfaction Among Mental Health Care Professionals. And what I'd like to do is introduce you to the study and give you some hints, some tricks, some tips that you can use when you're conducting and designing your own research. Let me start by introducing the study itself. The problem that first drew me to this research is the problem of high turnover among mental health care professionals. If you know anything about Children's Division, you know that the turnover among the workers there is very high. I also know that the job of helping children who are in traumatic circumstances causes or brings on or extracts a mental cost, an emotional cost from those who try to help. So mental health care exposes professionals to secondary traumatic stress. And therefore, I began to wonder, what is the relationship between secondary traumatic stress and high turnover and also low job satisfaction among mental health care professionals? Your research should always be theoretically derived. In other words, you don't just come up with an idea that sounds great to you. Even though that idea may be great, someone else might have already thought of it. Someone else might have already researched it, asked and answered those questions. So what you want to do is find a theory that helps explain your research and fit it into what is already known in your field. I used Stam's Professional Quality of Life model, which contains two consequences for exposure to trauma. The first one is called compassion satisfaction. In other words, by helping people, you have a good feeling about yourself. But the second is called secondary traumatic stress. It's a negative consequence that comes as the result of being exposed to the traumatic stories of others. Compassion fatigue is what secondary traumatic stress is typically called, because compassion fatigue always includes secondary traumatic stress, the fear and anxiety from exposure to trauma, but it may or may not include burnout, which is exhaustion, frustration, anger, depression. Burnout can occur among any field. Compassion fatigue and secondary traumatic stress always occur only among mental health care professionals. So what I tried to do with my research was combine clinical psychology with organizational psychology. And what I want you to follow is the theoretical way that I lay out the reason for my research. So in my literature review, I generally followed this pattern. First of all, I established the research about compassion fatigue being caused by exposure to traumatic material or secondary traumatic stress. I then explained how compassion fatigue had been theorized by its researchers to be a special form of burnout. Although burnout can occur in other professions, this special form of burnout was experienced only by mental health care professionals, only by those who have been exposed to trauma. I then went back and showed that burnout had been correlated to low job satisfaction, and low job satisfaction contributes to turnover. So knowing that turnover among mental health care professionals is high, it would make sense that this special form of burnout, called compassion fatigue, decreases job satisfaction and contributes to overall turnover. So what I wanted to know was, is secondary traumatic stress associated with low job satisfaction and increased turnover among mental health care professionals? And furthermore, I wanted to know whether compassion satisfaction would in any way moderate that relationship. Does it work as some kind of buffer to make it easier for professionals to cope with secondary traumatic stress? So again, notice how I very clearly, step by step, lay out the purpose for my research. That's what you should be doing in your literature review. I then came up with 6 research questions. You should notice that the research questions are structured in almost exactly the same way, and they all relate to the interaction or relationship between variables. So structure your research questions based on your variables, and the rest of your analysis is going to go so much easier. First of all, my research question, will secondary traumatic stress relate negatively with job satisfaction? among mental health care professionals? Will secondary traumatic stress correlate negatively with job satisfaction? And then research question 2 is exactly the same, except will secondary traumatic stress relate positively with increased turnover and tension among mental health care professionals? So notice it's all about the relationship between variables. The next 2 questions go together. Compassion satisfaction should relate positively with job satisfaction and negatively with turnover. And the 5th and 6th research questions are about moderation. Does compassion satisfaction moderate the relationship between secondary traumatic stress and job satisfaction, or between secondary traumatic stress and turnover and tension? Structure your research questions based upon your variables, and you'll know 2 things. 1, you'll know how you are going to measure your variables. And 2, you'll know how you're going to analyze those variables. Now, here's the approach that I took. I used a non-experimental, in other words, I didn't try to manipulate the independent variable. I just measured variables and correlated them. That was my methodology. It was quantitative because I was measuring things. I wasn't using a qualitative methodology. And it was survey-based. I measured my variables using the Professional Quality of Life Scale, which measured secondary traumatic stress and compassion satisfaction. I also used the Job Satisfaction Survey, and I decided to use the overall score. Even though it's a facet satisfaction survey, I could have used any of 9 facets. I chose to use the overall score. And I measured turnover and tension with the turnover and tension questionnaire. So going in, I knew exactly how I was going to measure each variable. Great. Now all I need to do is decide how to analyze them. I used correlations and moderated regression. So what I learned from my correlations was that compassion satisfaction is related to high job satisfaction and low turnover, and that secondary traumatic stress was related to low job satisfaction and high turnover. But what I didn't expect was this interaction between the 3 variables. What this line, or these sets of lines, show me is that secondary traumatic stress does in fact relate to low job satisfaction, but notice that it's the high compassion satisfaction line that has the strongest relationship. Here's what I would expect. If compassion satisfaction is a buffer, I should have a straight line, a flat line, for my high CS line. But instead, look, it's the low CS line that's a flat line. There's no difference in job satisfaction based on secondary traumatic stress for those with low compassion satisfaction. But those with high compassion satisfaction are affected more profoundly by increasing secondary traumatic stress. So what does that mean? Instead of being a buffer, compassion satisfaction almost seems to be making the problem worse. Job satisfaction decreases more profoundly under secondary traumatic stress for people who have high compassion satisfaction. So, what do I do? Well, anytime you find an outcome that you don't expect, you have to explain it. It is possible that people who have high compassion satisfaction are people who are already high in emotional intelligence and empathy, and therefore they are more profoundly affected by secondary traumatic stress, whereas people who are low in compassion satisfaction just aren't as affected. It could be that what I found was unique to this sample. And so, the way that I should move forward is to replicate these findings. Anytime you have anomalous findings that just don't match up with what you think they should be, replicate. Find out what is going on. Is it just my sample, or is there something here that I simply didn't expect to find that maybe no one else has known of because they haven't used this particular analysis to look closely enough? So now what I'm doing with my children's division research is replication. I'm testing the same variables, compassion satisfaction and compassion fatigue, and the same outcome variables, job satisfaction and turnover, and I'm doing it with a different sample. Will I find the same outcome with that sample? I don't know. But if I do, I will have some explaining to do. So hopefully this has been of benefit to you. You have a little better understanding of the type of research that I did and that I'm continuing to do, and hopefully you have some ideas that will help you with your own research. Thank you for listening, and I wish you the best with your research projects.